Hello and welcome back to my channel. Welcome to another month of reading. So what are we reading in April? I thought I would work on my 40 before 40 list. I'm going to be turning 40 in October. So that's about 6 months from now and I need to get cracking. Am I where I want to be on this list? No. Am I where I realistically expected to be? Yes. I made this list about 4-ish years ago. So if I had done this properly, I would have read about 10 books a year and I would have had about 5 books left at this point. Instead I have 17. Still manageable. But I do need to put in some effort, especially since I have read most of the books that I already owned, so I need to actually actively get them from the library and such. I've been pretty good at reading some of the longer classics. I've read Anna Karenina, I've read The Woman in White. I'm making really good progress with The Count of Monte Cristo at the moment. But I have been ignoring some of the non-fiction on the list. I basically tried to get as many books from the library as I could find. Here's what I've got now. I've got some books on my Kobo that I could read. And yeah, we're just gonna see how many of them I can read this month. So obviously I've got my cup. I thought I would pick both a fiction and a non-fiction just to begin with, and I put them on different colored papers just so I'm getting a good mix, and then when I finish a fiction book I will pick the next fiction, and the same with non-fiction. Okay, so I've got 2 different colored papers. If I remember correctly, the blue one was non-fiction and the white ones were fiction. But that doesn't matter, I'm just gonna pick one of both of them. Okay, so here we've got the first one, which is a blue one, and that is Into Thin Air, so it is non-fiction. There we go, Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer. This is the Dutch edition. I have really enjoyed Into the Wild. I've read that years ago, and ever since then I've always wanted to read another Jon Krakauer. And this seems to be one that a lot of people recommend. So that's my first non-fiction book. And then let's pick another one. That's a blue one. There we go, that's a white one. And that is The Magnificent Spinster. This I've got on my Kobo. It is a book by Sarton. And maybe a big reason that I wanted to read this book is because of the title. I think The Magnificent Spinster is a great title. Honestly, right now I can't remember what it was about. I know it's got an older protagonist, and I also know Russell from Ink and Paper Blog really loved this book when he read it, which could be about 10 years before. So yeah, reading Into Thin Air and The Magnificent Spinster to start with. And I'll check back in when I've read either of them. So I have read Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer, and oh my god, what a story this is. Jon Krakauer was asked by a sort of outdoor adventure magazine to do an article on the commercialization of Mount Everest. And originally he was supposed to go to the base camp and report from there. However, he had been a very avid mountain climber when he was younger, and he was like, if I'm going to travel all the way to Nepal, then I want to try and reach the top. So the magazine gave him a year to train, and in the spring of 1996 he started his ascent as part of a group expedition, not knowing but that by the end of the trip 8 people would have died, and this particular season on the mountain would become the deadliest one up to date. And this book is basically Krakauer's reckoning of his experience on the mountain and an attempt to piece together the puzzle as much as he can from what he knew and what he learned and experienced, and what he after that learned from interviewing other people who were on the mountains during the same days. As a book, this reads very quickly. It's absolutely hammering, it's propulsive. You know what will happen and that it will end in disaster, but you also cannot look away. From early on in the book, as someone who has no interest in mountain climbing whatsoever, I kept on thinking, why are you doing this? You know, when Krakauer explains what happens to your body when you don't take enough time to acclimatize your body to the lack of oxygen. When you think about the costs, it costs thousands and thousands of dollars to get a permit to climb Mount Everest and pay a guide and all that. When he talks about how families and relationships are ripped apart because someone is away for months and months going on a life-threatening expedition. So already in the beginning, I'm like, it doesn't really sound like anything good can come from this. Now Krakauer does go into that a little bit, saying that to climb Mount Everest, you have to be a little bit crazy. Of course, you need fitness, you need stamina, you need good health, but also a really strong drive to do it, because you won't make it otherwise. He describes how mountaineers will get something they call top fever, sort of an unstoppable need to reach the top. And do I fully understand this urge? No. But I have to at least try to comprehend it, to be able to read this story. And then the further you get into the book, the more and more anxious you get, because you know it's not going to end well. Retroactively and from an outside perspective, it's very easy to say that even trying to attempt this is not a very good idea. You know, the cause of the number of deaths on that particular trip was ultimately a snowstorm. But even if I just look at Krakauer's own experience, who managed to reach the top and managed to get back down again, it was so stressful to believe. I think you have to realize, or you know, it's something that I didn't really realize before, is that climbing a mountain of this kind of size is a trip of about 6 weeks. There's about 4 different camps, like all the way to the top, and you know, during the period they will first stay in the first camp a little while, then take a few day trips up to the second camp, maybe the third camp, and then coming back, etc, etc. So by the time you actually have that final day where they go from the last camp to the top, they've already had 6 weeks of climbing. So by that time they are exhausted, they are sleep deprived, they are often delirious with oxygen deprivation, they've been dealing with extreme cold for weeks. So that doesn't really sound like a state one would want to be in when trying to climb a mountain in extreme conditions where the tiniest error in judgment could result in death. So most of the time during this book I was like, can you please all stop being so egotistical? Come back down, no one's gonna think any less of you, you made your point, please stop. I don't get it. I just felt kind of nauseous throughout most of this book. I think even though Krakauer did the best with the information he had, he also did not really have enough emotional distance from the story to give a true account of the events. I think he had opinions on certain members of the expedition that really tainted his portrayal of them, which I thought was unfair towards those people. And like I said, he spent a lot of time during that trip oxygen deprived and feeling very unwell. So in how far can we really trust his account? I think in conclusion we will never exactly know what happened and how these tragic deaths came to be. I did appreciate that the author manages to convey what it is like on Mount Everest, you know, what elements come into play and how the mountain is just relentless. He also goes into mountaineering as a business, sort of the competitiveness between different companies that offer Everest tours, what the role of Sherpas is on the mountain, and what the mountaineering business means to Nepal and Tibet as countries, the repercussions in terms of the environment. I find that all very interesting. But I think ultimately this was truly a very uncomfortable read, and I do not want to read anything on this topic for a very long time. Okay, so that was Into Thin Air, and let's see what my next non-fiction book will be. So I've got my cup here. I still got both my fiction and non-fiction here, and if I remember correctly, the blue ones were non-fiction. So let's see. That's a white one. There we go, that's a blue one. And that is, oh no, I did not want this one. That is The Body Keeps the Score. Let me grab it. So this is The Body Keeps the Score. This is the Dutch translation by Bessel van Kolk. This is a book on how traumatic events can manifest in a physical way in the body, which is a topic I find very interesting. I have learned since I've put this on my 40 before 40 list that this book is very sort of Western white male centered, but still this is very much spoken of as a very foundational book on the topic. But it is, I think, going to be a difficult topic. That's why I wasn't really looking forward to it, and also it's massive. I think the way Dutch books are published, they are often a lot bigger. Like if you get like the Penguin English version of this, it seems a lot smaller. But yeah, so it's not as sort of intimidating as it may look like this, but still. But yeah, I'm gonna just slowly make my way through this, and I'll check back in when I've read some more. I read The Magnificent Spinster by May Sarton, and it's one of those books that I really enjoyed reading, even though I can objectively say that it's not that good. It is quite a flawed book, but I still had a marvelous time with it. The book follows the life of Jane Reed. Her life spanned about 80 years, from the early 1900s through the 80s. The narrator of the story is her friend Cam. She basically decides to tell Jane's life story, and this is kind of the result of that. She's using her memories, other people's recollections, letters, to put her life story together. So even though it is entirely fictional, it does read like Jane Reed was a real person, and this is her biography. Jane grows up in New England. She has quite a privileged childhood. For example, her parents own an island off the coast of Maine where they spend a lot of their summers, and that island will still play a significant role in Jane's later life. Her parents are both intellectual people, upper class people. There's a strong focus on academics in her childhood. She's expected to go to Radcliffe College, which was like the woman's counterpart of Harvard, but she decides to go to Vassar College, which was just as prestigious, but considered a little bit more liberal, a little bit more progressive at the time. And she ends up working as a teacher at an all-girls private school. Now Jane, or Miss Reed as she's called throughout the book as well, is a very singular person. From a young age it is clear that she has a zest for life. She finds great joy in the company of her friends. She has this eagerness to learn. She loves art. She has a genuine interest in other people. And she's just someone who chooses her own path regardless of what other people would think. I would say she's a larger-than-life character, but that's not quite what I mean, because in many ways she is rather ordinary. Nothing she does will ever go into the history books. She's good at her job, she's successful in other endeavors, but not remarkably so. But the influence she has on her friends, her pupils, other people who are close to her is really undeniable. She has a gift to make anyone feel welcome and feel interesting and feel important. She's someone who manages to always pull out the best in people. As the title may reveal, she never gets married, and in fact it doesn't seem like she really takes a romantic interest in anyone, although she does form lifelong partnerships with other people. The book actually has some discussion on asexuality, and I know I shouldn't be surprised by it considering the title, but I still was, because I really didn't think it would be so explicitly mentioned. So yeah, I loved how this book showed the life of a woman who made her life meaningful, not in the traditional getting married, having kids, etc. kind of way, but making her mark as a teacher, as a friend, and fully enjoying life as it comes. Like I said, this book definitely was flawed. The narrator of the book, she seems to absolutely love Jane Reed, and a lot of this book is just her gushing about Jane, telling us how wonderful Jane was, which makes it kind of twee or like saccharine sometimes. It's all a little bit sickly sweet in places. I think also the book could use some more editing. It lacked some structure. It was almost like this fictional narrator of Jane's story was still in the process of writing her biography, and we were shown different parts of what she had written so far rather than the finished product, if that makes sense. And I think the last thing that bothered me in this book, that was quite a lot of telling and not showing in this book, and that sort of kept me out of the story at a couple of times. But yeah, I still had a really good time reading it. It's the kind of low stakes book that you could turn to for a comfort read, a book you can return to and it being like a warm hug to read it. It's a quiet, unassuming kind of story that still has a power to linger and make you ponder. And I think after reading this, anyone would want to have a friend like Jane Reed in their lives. So yeah, that was The Magnificent Spinster. And let's pick another book. So I've got my cup here. I'm picking another fiction book right now. So that's one of the white slips. And there we go. And that is The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. I have read a couple of his works, but definitely more the sort of science fiction, speculative fiction ones. I've read Never Let Me Go and Clara and the Sun, but this is more historical fiction, which I'm very keen to read. So yeah. So I read The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, and I was so ready to love this book, but I didn't, and I'm sad about it. This was first published in 1989. It won the Booker Prize that year. Ishiguro has later won the Nobel Prize. So there is no denying that this is an accomplished novel. The story starts in 1956 and we meet Mr. Stevens. He is the butler of Darlington Hall, which is a big stately home somewhere near Oxford. It doesn't say exactly how old Mr. Stevens is at this point, but it becomes clear that he has been in service for Lord Darlington since the 1920s. Lord Darlington has recently deceased and the house has been bought by a wealthy American. It is not quite the grand place it used to be, and there is definitely a lot less personnel. But Mr. Stevens is a butler who tries to do his work with as much dignity and diligence as he can in the changing circumstances. Now, at the beginning of the book, his new employer encourages him to take a few days off because he's going to be away himself, and he decides to take up on this advice, and he goes on what he calls a motoring trip to the south of England, in part also to visit Miss Kenton, who was his former colleague at Darlington Hall. And during this trip he sort of reminisces about his life working as a butler, how he always worked to the best of his abilities. He remained very loyal to his employer. He thinks about what he believes to be the best qualities of a good butler, about his relationship with his father, who was a butler as well, also his relationship with Miss Kenton, and he's just sort of reflecting back on different moments in his life, how he felt about them, how he maybe would do things differently now. And I've heard this book being described as quietly devastating, and I can see why that is. Mr. Stevens was a man, or is a man, with an incredible sense of duty and responsibility. He is very concerned with doing things the right way and with dignity, and the book shows how he may have gone too far with this, and it may have caused him to miss out on love and personal connections with other people, and also maybe his loyalty and devotion to his employer and his work has blinded him to see his employer for who he really was, which was a morally complex person who turned out to be a Nazi sympathizer. And during the course of this book, Mr. Stevens gradually realizes this himself, and so this book becomes a reflection on regrets and missed opportunities. And the thing is, I can see how well this book is crafted. I can see the intricate ways the themes are being explored. I can see the careful development of the character. I could see that this is a book with so many layers to explore, and yet when I read the last sentence I was like, oh well, that was that. And I also knew that that was not the reaction I was supposed to have when finishing this book. I can objectively see the quality of this book, and I can objectively see how this book should have left me devastated. But I wasn't. I felt very unmoved by this book. And I think that really shows how our taste in books is so personal. In theory, I should have loved this, but I didn't, and I can't say exactly why. I guess it's just personal taste. I can also imagine maybe if I had picked this up at another time, a different stage in life, in a different frame of mind, maybe this would have resonated with me a lot more. I'm kind of sad that this didn't work out for me the way I wanted it to, but I'm still glad I read it, because now at least I don't feel like I'm missing out for not having read it. So yeah, that was the remains of the day. We only have a few days left in April, so I'm not going to pick another book randomly, just because I wanted to make sure I have something that I can actually finish by the end of the month. So I will be reading Picnic at Hanging Rock by Joan Lindsay. This is the Dutch translation, and this is about 250 pages or so I'll be able to finish that. And I'm also still reading The Body Keeps the Score, which I'm a fair way in, but is still a chunky non-fiction book. And I am also very, very nearly finished with The Count of Monte Cristo. I have about 40 or so pages left. So yeah, as you can see, only a tiny bit left. So yeah, that's all still to come later. So I have read The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. This is the Dutch translation. I don't feel entirely qualified to give a full review of the book, but I can share some thoughts I had. Van der Kolk is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Boston, and he has nearly 40 years of experience working with people who have experienced trauma in varying degrees. And in this book he talks about the connection between mind and brain and body, how all of these are impacted by trauma. He differentiates between trauma during childhood or adulthood, and the difference between singular traumatic events and sustained long-term trauma. I find this a very interesting topic. I appreciate how he explains that the fear of the trauma and the reliving of trauma and the subsequent feeling of isolation and alienation from other people and yourself will actually change part of the brain. And he provides insight on how traumatized people can be overcome with fits of rage, intense fear, and why they are not able to concentrate or go into trustful relationships with other people or feel comfortable in their own bodies. I'm going to put this down because it's getting kind of heavy. It's a big chunky book. Yeah, it talks about different forms of therapy and how trauma often requires a integral approach, working both from the outside in and the inside out, meaning that in his experience the best results are when patients both work on the brain side, finding words, being able to talk about what happened to you, things like EMDR therapy and mindfulness, but also addressing the effects in the body by doing yoga and breathing exercises and doing family structures or drama therapy where you engage in a very physical way. Of course, it's impossible to reduce it to a few sentences, but I think he explains really well, very carefully, the importance of different forms of therapy that use both the mind, the brain and the body. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting topic. I think the author makes the topic very accessible. He explains it very clearly, and it's pretty easy to follow along even if you don't have any background in psychiatry. There was a few things, however, that didn't sit so well with me after reading this book. I think the first one is the disregard the author has of the use of medication in treating people with trauma-related disorders. He almost makes it out to be that the majority of psychiatrists will prescribe their patients large quantity of drugs, which will then make them unsusceptible for any other type of treatment, saying that drugs will only numb symptoms and not get into the cause of the problem. And whilst I do agree that prescribing drugs shouldn't be the only form of therapy, and I think it's problematic that a lot of research on treatment is funded by pharmaceutical companies, I also think it's short-sighted to speak so negatively on the use of prescription drugs when it's very helpful to many people. Secondly, I think he could have been a bit more careful in his descriptions of patients and his own experience in treating them, meaning that for a book that might be helpful for people who experience trauma, this book can be very triggering. He does say in the beginning that this book isn't meant as a self-help book, but I think he could have made this book a little bit more accessible for those who are looking for answers for their own problems and are taking steps in their own healing. I just think he should have been a bit more mindful of that. And then there were a couple of instances that made me feel a little bit uncomfortable. For example, there was an incident where he talked about a patient he treated who was a veteran from a war, I think the Vietnam War, but I'm not entirely sure. But he was traumatized by what he saw, but he also committed a lot of atrocities himself. And I do believe that someone who commits crime during war still deserves healthcare and treatment for their PTSD. I also think it's a really gross oversight of the author to then not even mention the effects that this would have on the victims in this situation, and almost portraying this veteran as the victim. Another instance was that he described one of his patients who was the victim of rape as beautiful, and for the author, who is a white male in a position of power, describing his patient who was the victim of sexual assault on the way she looked in a very subjective way, that really didn't sit very well with me. And then lastly, I know this is Bessel van der Kolk's own book, and he's one of the most leading prominent professionals in his field, but I felt like the overall tone of this book was very much bordering on self-righteousness. He mentions a lot of his own research and his own experiences, and of course he has every right to do so, but it was very much a case of I had this random conversation which made me have an insight that no one had had before, and of course I had to set up a research with my team, and lo and behold, we discovered something no one had considered before, and I had to try it out on my own patients, and we saw a 99% improvement. And I'm like, yeah, okay, just put another feather in your own cap. That happened a couple of times, and it just made me a little apprehensive. So yeah, overall still a very insightful, interesting, comprehensive book on the subject, and I think it's a really good place to start, but I would also love to read other people's view on the topic and just learn more about it that way. I was very aware that this is just one person's take. So yeah, those were my thoughts on The Body Keeps the Score. And then I also finished The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. Again, putting it down because it's heavy. I did this book as a buddy read, and we read one chapter every day, starting on the 1st of January. And this book was such a ride. It's an epic tale of adventure and love and revenge, and during its 1177 pages, I did not once get bored. It's a book that is filled to the brim with shocking reveals and unexpected twists, leaving me excited to see what would happen every single day. Here is a glimpse of what you can find in this book. There is false accusations, there's wrongful imprisonment, digging your way out of prison with a spoon, switched identities, smugglers and pirates, lost treasure, drug-induced psychedelic trips, bandits, financial ruin, gambling, disguises, poisoning, lesbian awakenings, duels, murder, illegitimate children. I could go on. Was this book bordering ridiculous, and did I lose the plot on several occasions? Yes. Was I along for the ride? Also yes. I had to suspend my disbelief so many times and just let the story take me on a wild, crazy adventure. And yeah, I'm sure Dumas also had something to say on the history of France at the time with the Bonapartes and the Royalists. Maybe there's some religious aspect to it, and a discussion what happens when you play God. There's also something in there about inheriting the sins of your parents. There is more in-depth stuff in there if you want to go into that. But I read this completely for the adventure of it, eager to find out what would happen in every chapter, and I think in that it absolutely succeeded. So yeah, that's 2 massive books finished from my 40 before 40 list, and I'm very proud of myself having read these. So the last book I wanted to talk about in this video is Picnic at Hanging Rock by Joan Lindsay. I think we could consider this an Australian modern classic. It was first published in 1967, but it's actually set in the year 1900. So the novel starts on Valentine's Day of that year, which is obviously summer in Australia, and some of the pupils and teachers of Appleyard Academy, which is like a private all-girls boarding school, they go on an outing to Hanging Rock to have a picnic. Hanging Rock is a real place, kind of a rock formation, and they have food, they play, they hang about, they relax. You know how a picnic works. And then towards the end of the day, a group of 4 of the girls decide to explore the area a little bit and have a walk around, but then only one of them returns and she is in hysterics. And then also one of the teachers disappears without anyone ever seeing her leaving. I'm not going to tell you much more about the plot or what happens next because I want to be careful not to spoil too much. But it basically deals with the aftermath of this event. Obviously the police gets involved trying to find these girls and trying to figure out what happened. There's some people in the neighborhood who get mixed up with the story. We see the impact it has on the other students and the teachers and the headmistress of the school. I think this book has all the makings of a cult classic. The author starts by saying that the reader needs to decide for themselves whether this story is fact or fiction. So I feel like straight away she's putting the ownership of the book with the reader. And then throughout the book you'll spend a lot of time trying to figure out what has happened, and you can get wildly speculative with it. This book is very ambiguous, and it has a strange sort of surreal feel to it, so it could be anything that happened, like freak accident, alien abduction, time travel. It also falls within the realms of possibility within this novel. I think the location of the Hanging Rock is itself is its own character, having this almost mythical, ancient, sentient quality to it. It's this sort of proper, rational, narrow-minded side of the British colonizer on the one hand, and then the wild, primal side of the earth on the other. Although I didn't really like that the author completely ignored the significance for a location and the power of the earth has for the Aboriginal people. I feel like this book would have had a lot more depth if she recognized the Indigenous people of Australia and of that area as sort of the original custodians of the land and the cultural significance the Hanging Rock had for them. There's also this idea of repression, of restriction on the lives of these girls and women in the way they dress and the way they need to behave at school and how they are expected to interact with other people outside the school and men in particular, and the chance of freedom and escape that this picnic gives them, even if it's just for a day. So yeah, I feel like this book has a cold vibe to it in that it allows the reader to go away with the book and make it their own thing. Having said all that, even though I think this story is very intriguing and has some fascinating elements, I also feel that it kind of fails in its execution. I think the pacing of the book is very uneven. It's sort of very plot-based in some parts and very quick, and then gets completely meandering in others. I think the characters are mostly very flat and I didn't feel any emotional connection to them, and I'm annoyed that one of the most interesting characters in the novel is the teacher that goes missing, and we never learn anything more about her than what we learn about her on the day of the picnic. She just sounded so interesting, and I think it's a shame we don't really learn more about her afterwards. So yeah, I think it's a book with a lot of potential, but ends up being one with kind of missed opportunities. So yeah, that was Picnic at Hanging Rock by Joan Lindsay. So like I said, that was the last book I read in April. I had a pretty good time this month reading, although I must say I wished I would have loved these books a bit more. Like, I liked all of them, but I didn't get any new favorites, which obviously I was hoping for, this being my 40 before 40 list. So yeah, here's this stack of all the books I've read. It might look a little bit more impressive than it actually is, since I read most of the kind of Monte Cristo before April, and also a lot of these books are library books, and they are always like bound bigger here in the Netherlands, but still got quite a bit of reading done, so very happy with that. Okay, so yeah, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any thoughts on any of the books I talked about in this video, please leave them down below. Also, if you have a 40 before 40 or 30 before 30, 50 before 50, whatever list, I'd love to know how you are doing with that, and like, how did you pick the books that you wanted to go on there? That's something that I am very interested in. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye bye.